Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to take a look at one of the most interesting and most effective Secretaries-General of the United Nations, and that's Kofi Annan. Abiodun Williams is a professor of the practice of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. He was Director of Strategic Planning to United Nations Secretaries-General Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon. He is the past chair of the Academic Council on the United Nations System, commonly called ACUNS. His latest book is entitled Kofi Annan and Global Leadership at the United Nations. Abby Williams, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's so good to see you again. It's been a while. It's been several years, as a matter of fact. But let's dive right into this. Why did you decide to write this book on Kofi Annan?
Well, I thought it was important to write a book on Kofi Annan because he was an extraordinary Secretary General, to try to sketch out the challenges that he faced during his tenure as Secretary General from 1997 to 2006, and how he met those challenges, and to trace the enduring changes that he made to the United Nations to improve how the organization works. And I thought it would be important at this particular moment to draw some lessons from Kofi Annan about the importance of leadership, and specifically the importance of leadership for the performance of a global institution.
And he, by many foreign policy experts, he is viewed as one of the most effective Secretaries General at the United Nations. He was from Ghana, and of course, he has probably, along with the other 8 Secretaries General, one of the toughest jobs in the world when you have a board of directors, the UN General Assembly right now of 193 countries, and you have to balance those interests. That's a very difficult job, is it not?
Yes, Kofi Annan was born in Ghana, and he devoted his career to the United Nations. He joined as a junior officer with the World Health Organization in Geneva, and he held a series of high-level positions at the United Nations, including as Under-Secretary General for peacekeeping operations before he became Secretary General. So he had an extraordinary knowledge of the workings of the United Nations, more than any of his predecessors and any of his successors. Kofi Annan also understood the United Nations and its politics. And he was extraordinary in the sense that he was able to balance vision with pragmatism, and to develop effective relations, not only with the Security Council, but with the other members of the UN. It's a very difficult job, as you say, but he never thought it was impossible.
No, he was very effective at it. He certainly was. Well, he had so many accomplishments in his tenure. One was the Millennium Development Goals, the predecessors really of the Sustainable Development Goals. Today, I guess, what were the Millennium Development Goals?
Well, Kofi Annan felt that the new millennium was a unique opportunity to bring the leaders of the world and the peoples of the world together to tackle urgent global tasks. And he persuaded the UN General Assembly to hold a Millennium Summit in the year 2000. In the lead up to the summit, he prepared a report entitled We the Peoples for leaders to consider, and the title drew on the words of the opening words of the Charter, and reflected Annan's view that even though the UN is an organization of states, it must address the needs of people everywhere. And in those recommendations in the report, 8 of those recommendations were later officially accepted as the Millennium Development Goals. And these were specific targets that the world was to aim at during the next 15 years. And they covered targets relating to poverty, to HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other infectious diseases. And he succeeded in placing the United Nations at the center of an issue of great moral importance, which is the alleviation of poverty. And the Millennium Development Goals, as you say, paved the way for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which we have today.
They certainly did, and they were very effective in doing that. Kofi Annan also had other really unique ideas that, I'm assuming these were from him, but two of them were the responsibility to protect, the R2P, and the establishment of the Human Rights Council to replace the old Human Rights Commission, which was not very effective in the eyes of many of the observers. But could you focus on those two just briefly?
The responsibility to protect, or R2P, is the international community's organizing principle for responding to genocide and mass atrocities. And the norm emerged as a reaction to the failure of the international community to respond to the genocides in Rwanda and former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And Kofi Annan urged the member states to adopt the responsibility to protect, which they did at the World Summit in 2005. And the responsibility to protect was a tremendous innovation because it reflected the Annan doctrine that sovereignty must not be used as a shield, as an excuse for mass atrocity crimes. In terms of human rights, Annan was a great advocate for human rights, and he believed that human rights and the cause of human rights lies at the very heart of the UN's mission. And he believed that the main purposes of the UN, development, security, and human rights, were inextricably linked. So for him, human rights were important as intrinsic values, but they're also important to achieve other goals of the United Nations, such as the prevention of conflict and the alleviation of poverty. And the Human Rights Council is his most important institutional legacy in terms of human rights, because he felt that the framers and the founders of the UN had left an institutional gap in the organization. We have the Security Council dealing with peace and security, and we have the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, focusing on development, economic issues, and the Human Rights Council would elevate, he believed, human rights to its proper institutional place in the organization, and would help to promote and protect human rights.
It certainly does. It works in that area. Looking at Kofi Annan's career, what do you think was? I mean, he had so many accomplishments, without a doubt. What do you think is his most outstanding accomplishment?
Well, as you say, he had a number of outstanding accomplishments. We've talked about the responsibility to protect. We've also mentioned human rights. I would also mention that the important contribution he made in establishing the UN's peace-building architecture, which comprises the Peace-Building Commission, the Peace-Building Fund, and the Peace-Building Support Office. Because it was clear to him that after UN peacekeeping missions have left, countries were at risk of falling back into conflict. And so the peace-building architecture was established to help countries make the difficult transition from war to peace. I think that's an enormous accomplishment institutionally. In terms of just the way the UN works. It is normal in most governments, for example, to have a cabinet, but the UN hadn't had a cabinet until Kofi became Secretary-General. So he established the Senior Management Group, which brings together the senior heads of the departments to help to manage the organization. And it was also at his urging that the General Assembly established the post of the Deputy Secretary-General, which helps in terms of the management of the organization.
That is so critical, especially in the areas of accountability and improving the effectiveness of the United Nations. And he was very, very effective at doing that. Excuse me. When you look back at Kofi Annan, he also focused on the non-governmental organizations, academia, the private sector, other players that are absolutely critical in helping the United Nations achieve its goals, did he not?
Yes, Kofi Annan recognized that in an era of globalization, states were not the only important actors in the world, and that the United Nations could not achieve its objectives by relying exclusively on states and interstate power and interstate cooperation. So he reached out to non-state actors, to NGOs, to academia, and in the most striking departure from his predecessors, the private sector, in establishing, for example, the UN Global Compact. And he did this because he recognized that non-state actors could provide access to technology, to expertise, which could help the UN. They also had resources, which the organization could draw on in its work, particularly in its development work. And non-state actors could help to become advocates for the UN's mission. And he was able to build these partnerships by drawing primarily on his convening power in bringing NGOs, civil society, academics, Nobel laureates together to tackle specific global challenges. And for example, when it came to HIV/AIDS, he was able to bring together the CEOs of the leading pharmaceutical companies, and he persuaded them to make antiretroviral drugs available at affordable prices in developing countries. And so millions of people are alive today because Kofi Annan reached out to non-state actors and used his immense convening power to make a difference.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an intra-campus television hookup at an educational institution, or you just have a computer and you like our shows and you want to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at a very interesting and one of the most effective, if not the most effective, Secretaries-General of the United Nations, and that's Kofi Annan. My guest today is Professor Abiodun Williams, who is in the practice of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. His latest book is entitled Kofi Annan and the Global Leadership at the United Nations. Abby, we're talking about Kofi Annan and the remarkable leadership he did provide. He was a lightning rod to some degree, I guess, because I remember during the illegal invasion of Iraq by the United States and some of its allies, Kofi Annan was one of the first who came out to basically to critique it and to let people know that this was not a legal invasion. as I recall, wasn't he being interviewed in London by one of the broadcasters over there when he had that interview? And it caused quite a bit of furor, but he was right on that. And how did that impact his tenure as Secretary-General of the United Nations?
Yes. Well, Kofi Annan's tenure as Secretary-General coincided with the unipolar moment in world affairs when world affairs were dominated by a single superpower, the United States. So it was necessarily one of Annan's priorities to maintain a working relationship with the United States. And he was able to do so without alienating other members of the United Nations. When he took office as Secretary General, the UN was facing a huge financial crisis and was close to bankruptcy because the US Congress was withholding $1.3 billion in arrears as pressure for reform. And Kofi explained to the US Congress and to the American people, who largely supported the UN, why US leadership was important for the organization and why an effective United Nations was in America's national interest. It was when he opposed the invasion of Iraq, which was conducted without hard evidence or international legal justification and without Security Council approval, that the relationship ran into difficulty because he had used his exceptional diplomatic skills to persuade the US Congress to pay its outstanding arrears. Kofi Annan responded with his usual dignity. He set up an investigation and also, I think ultimately in retrospect, the invasion of Iraq cost thousands of American service lives and cost lots of thousands of lives in Iraq and led to regional instability. So in retrospect, I think Annan has a reasonable claim to prescience. But this relationship, I think, underlines that the job of Secretary General is a tightrope walk, and it requires extraordinary diplomatic acuity and agility.
It certainly does, and he displayed it with a tremendous amount of expertise, I would say, watching him. Of course, you worked for him directly, but he was a remarkable person. And he was one of the most transformational Secretaries General of the United Nations. I think there have been 9 up to this point. What were some other qualities that he had that served him? He was a very reserved person. He was calm, cool, and collected, as they would say. But what were some of those other qualities?
Well, Kofi Annan had a realistic humility about the UN's purposes, which he combined with bold and visionary leadership, thereby maximizing the organization's potential where it had a special role to play. And I think his tenure as Secretary General should remind us that realism about the UN's deficiencies does not entail fatalism about the opportunities it presents. He was a person of great integrity, compassion, and above all, moral courage.
Well, the United Nations of 2024 is certainly not the United Nations of 1994 or even before that, because it has improved so immensely in what it does. It still has challenges, obviously. There's no doubt about that. What, as an observer of the United Nations, you're an expert. You worked inside the institution. You have been outside the institution. You've monitored it. You've evaluated it. Do you have any recommendations or suggestions to make the UN more effective? I know they constantly talk about, well, we're going to restructure the Security Council, which personally I don't think will ever happen at the rate they're going. We've been talking about it for 40 years now, but maybe it will. I can't say. But do you have any suggestions on how to make the UN even more effective than what it is today?
Well, as you say, the Security Council is certainly in need of reform, and the Council is often paralyzed by the use of the veto by the 5 permanent members of the Council. It is a very difficult task, but I think no reform of the United Nations will be complete without reform of the Security Council. I also think that there should be opportunities to try to make small but significant reforms that would allow the General Assembly to have its foot in the door on security matters, especially when the Security Council is blocked. But yes, UN reform is much needed, but I think even more necessary is political will to really use the United Nations in the way that it was meant to be used.
You're absolutely right on all counts there, because the UN Security Council has to reform itself or restructure to some degree. And there are a lot of proposals out there that I think would be maybe amenable to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, but it does have to move forward in that area without a doubt in order to be a more effective organization. So it's absolutely critical to do that. As you look at the UN and just the whole family of United Nations agencies and how they impact our lives every day, all 8 billion people on the planet are impacted in one way or the other by services provided by the United Nations to either move aircraft, ships, mail, weather information internationally, whatever. We are all impacted to some degree. But when people say today, is the United Nations still relevant? What do you say to them?
I'd say the United Nations, many people, of course, focus on the Security Council and the deadlock in the Council. But there are many ways in which the UN makes a difference. It's relevant in terms of its peacekeeping operations, which are deployed in areas of conflict, and the peacekeepers help to provide the space for combating warring factions, to make a difference and to try to come up with long-term solutions to conflicts. And all the whole range of agencies, the World Health Organization, as we saw during the COVID pandemic, plays a critical role in terms of health. Agencies like the World Food Program as well. So in terms of food security, in terms of peacekeeping and World Health, the UN agencies affect our lives. And the organization is imperfect, but I do think that it is our last best hope that we have in trying to address the range of global challenges which are confronting the world.
Certainly is, and it's just been said for decades that the UN can only be as successful as its member states will allow it to be. And they have to get behind the programs, and they have to work together to collaborate to make the UN a success, because it is so important. We can't abandon the United Nations. But Professor Abby Williams, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much, Bill. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you, sir. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.